Welcome to History 2020. My name is Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester, which, for God's sakes, you better hope at this point too that I'm going to be your professor for the rest of the semester. If we don't make it to the end of the semester, that's we not making it to the end of the semester. All right. I need to make it so you can make it. Let's make it together. The thing that I'm going to try to do is, as hard as it is, I'm picking out what I think are like really important moments in American history and themes. One of the things that I think is important is that I think about what's going on right now. I think about what's going on in your lives. And so, as the story goes, when I have so much to cover, one of the things that I do is I try to pick themes that might help explain what's going on now. So, what I'm going to focus on from the 1960s up as far as we can basically go is going to be the development of American distrusts of government. One of the things I want to point out is that, this isn't something that just affects one party. And just in case anybody, is thinking that the reason I say that is like, oh, American distrust the government, like I'm making a political jab now. I'm not at all. This is something that has happened. When you look at the way Americans related to their government in the 1950s and early 1960s. Compare that to today. The overall distrust much stronger than it had been before. I think that you can't understand that unless you look back at what happened during the Vietnam War in sense. So that will be one of the themes here in these next few lectures. The last one even though the last one was quite all over the place, both in terms of geography where we went and in terms of topics, you see another theme there, which is how much of a world we live in now is about the Cold War. How much of it still, long after the Cold War is gone, is how much the civil rights movement, how much our culture, how much of Americans' presence in the minds of the world was shaped by that. And so today, we're going to talk about how Vietnam and going into Watergate really broke Americans' trust in government in a way that I think has never been recovered. And I think that, maybe you could argue that it has been. I think that'd be a hard argument to make. This is something I think most people agree on. Last time we spoke about the civil rights movement. Again, George Wallace, the importance of the Cold War in shaping the world. We talked about the Cold War's impact on exploration. And we wrapped up with the beginning of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And I think that probably if there was any really important lesson to take away from that last lecture, I think we all know that it almost certainly is that the Soviets got the deepest hole, the Kola super deep borehole. It was super deep. And in fact, there, as far as we know, were no sounds of soul screaming coming out of it, in spite of what you maybe heard from some friends. So today, let's pick up where we left off last time. I kind of wrapped up with the fact that the Cold War took us to space, to the moon. It took a dog to the moon in a weird apparatus. The dog looked happy, but I'm not sure it really was. We left off with one place that most of you knew that it took us, which was to Vietnam. Just a little background on this, and I already mentioned this talking about Eisenhower. What happens in Vietnam is largely a function of decolonization after World War II. The British and French had these massive empires that spread around the world. And after World War II, they begin to abandon them. Basically, they can't hold on to them. There's new, better ways actually to get what you want out of foreign countries, aside from investing a lot of resources and actually occupying them. That's another story. But the French were holding down this area called Indochina. And in 1954, they finally backed off. They finally said, all right, we're out. They were defeated in a series of battles. And following that, Indochina, this area that the French had dominated, becomes divided into, at the time, 5 different countries, today 4. But they're Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and at the time, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. These two portions, the general agreement when they were divided was they would be united eventually, but that, some planning had to be made for that. And the years that follow, the North and the South, they fall under very different types of government. In the North, what you see is a communist government coming to power. In the South, however, you have a government that is committed to preventing communism, but a government in South Vietnam that is also up against the fact that there is wide popular support for joining the North under the banner of communism. We had already begun to invest a lot of money in propping up the non-communist regime in South Vietnam. Under Eisenhower, he had sent, a group of advisors there, but we hadn't really sent soldiers on the ground at that point. And all of this, again, is to back up this government that, by all accounts, is really questionable. The only thing is, though, they promise not to be communists. They're basically, we won't be communists. We will maintain a foot in with the United States. And as you guys know from what happened in Guatemala, as you guys know from what happened in Iran, all over the world, the United States definitely does not want a communist government to pop up somewhere. But there's only so much you can do. So once Kennedy is inaugurated as president, remember the line, Kennedy wanted to win the Cold War more than anything, but he had no idea what that meant. He begins to invest the U.S. more and more. From January 61 to November 1963, U.S. military personnel increases from 900 to 16,000 Americans who are on the ground assisting that regime. The only issue is that as Kennedy becomes more and more invested in it, the problem is the DM gets in his way. The president of South Vietnam is, he's corrupt. He is not the kind of person that's really getting a lot of popular support. On November 2nd, 1963, this guy is assassinated. I'm just going to play something for you guys. This is the dictation of a John F. Kennedy recording his...
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon.
In other words, the U.S. knew it was coming.
I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views. While we did redress that balance in later wires, that first wire encouraged Lodge along a course to which he was, in any case, inclined.
You get that? The president of South Vietnam is basically picked off after a suggestion by the United States government that folks inside Vietnam eliminate him because he's a problem for U.S. efforts in the country. Again, we see a foreign leader and a foreign government being disposable to American interests. After this, there's more instability, and the United States becomes more and more involved. And just real quick, one of the things I think people have trouble getting about this is that there are different forces that we're talking about when we talk about the different armies. So you have, aside from the U.S., which is there, you have the North Vietnamese Army and you have the South Vietnamese Army. Those are standard armies. Those are, like any country has. But then inside of South Vietnam, you have the National Liberation Front. This is what's called the Viet Cong. This is a guerrilla organization inside of South Vietnam that is operating to undermine the U.S. presence there and the backing of the Saigon government to essentially support the aims of unification under the North. So these are different branches. Most Americans fought against the Viet Cong. These were South Vietnamese. These were not invading folks, although there were connections right between the North and the South. Essentially, the U.S. is fighting an insurrection. We are backing a minority side in a civil war. One of the fascinating things about the Vietnam War is that whereas the United States had fought in many wars and been very successful, the U.S. was generally fighting your standard army. They're wearing uniforms. This is on the ground guerrilla warfare. And what this means is you don't know who is on your side and who isn't. There's no markings. They're not wearing different uniforms. They're engaged in deception. And guerrilla warfare, that's how a small army defeats a large army. It's about defeating a nation's soul. It's about wearing them down. I mean, the goal of a guerrilla insurgence is not necessarily to gain territory. It is to wear out the outside force. And the advantage is you've got your home turf. You know exactly what the terrain is. You know people. A foreign government can't quite get that information. They don't know the area. It's it's very, very lush forests in Vietnam. It's hard to get good recon. And this is the rule of a guerrilla insurgence, one of the big rules. The invading force does not care about this place as much as we do. We care about this place because it is our home. We care about this place because we live here. So what's the invading force want out of this? And a lot of times what an invading force wants is wealth. They want strategic positioning. It can be different. But here's the thing. Most people will never be beat out of loving the place that they live. But invading forces, their motives, you can wear them out of them. Now, can anybody who's familiar with early American history or was in my early U.S. history class, can you think of a time that basically guerrilla warfare took place amongst a non-standard kind of thrown together army against one of the world's largest military powers and it worked out? Yes, the American Revolution. Exactly. If you guys remember from those lectures on the American Revolution, I told you that Washington understood from the very beginning that the British cared about the American colonies primarily because of the wealth they produced and the advantages to the overall empire. And therefore, Washington's goal was just don't get caught. Wear them out. Hit and run, right? I mean, Washington, I tell you, one of his most amazing abilities as a military leader is he can escape. He's good at that. Doesn't sound that impressive unless you know what he's actually trying to do. He knows that it will eventually become too expensive. He knows the people back home will turn against him if he can just keep it going. Eventually it works. And in case you guys are like, whoa, are you drawing parallels between the Vietnam War and our American Revolution? I absolutely am. And I'm not the only one. Because the leaders in the Viet Cong and in the movement against American occupation of Vietnam studied Washington's tactics that he used against the British and incorporated those to defeat the country that created those strategies. It is, I think this story really captures like the irony of what the United States has become by the mid-20th century. We're this country that has built ourselves and created ourselves on the idea of independence, and yet through this kind of series of events, some well-intentioned, others not, but whatever they are, we find ourselves becoming something very different than the way that we imagine ourselves. And this is going to hit the U.S. pretty hard at home. I'll also say another thing about the guerrilla warfare. You don't have to take out an entire group of soldiers. If you can hit the right people, you can bring them down, right? So you hit the officers, you hit the people that can do a lot of specialized tasks. There's only one or two of those people that are around. And if you take out the top, then you can break down the rest of it. My father was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1966. And when he took the ASVAB, they said, all right, you've got two options. You can either do artillery, or we could send you, you'll become an officer, we'll send you to California and you'll study French, the French language. And my dad said that when he found that out, he was like, oh my God, are you kidding me? So I can either go to Vietnam or California? I'm going to Vietnam. Just kidding. California, just kidding. He's like, no, of course, I'm going to be an officer and study foreign language. And he said it was a damn good thing that before he went and actually signed those papers, he realized the reason they were training him to speak French. You guys remember what country had been in that area prior to 1954? France. And I don't know if you guys have looked at either becoming a French language major or a Vietnamese language major, but just a quick glance will tell you that learning French is way easier for a native English speaker. Well, in Vietnam, a lot of the villages, because of the French occupation, had villagers that spoke French so they could actually translate through a French person, American who spoke French. They were training my father to go into Vietnam and gather information. That's what he would have done. And they would have, he would have been going around and he would have had a double bonus bullseye on him, which would have been, you're an officer and you're an interpreter. And my dad says, thank goodness I realized, because the life expectancy of an interpreter at Vietnam was about 15 minutes, because guerrilla warfare is about finding that person. That was an exaggeration. Some of you guys were like, what? And he hit the ground and they were like, run, boy. That's not how it worked. Well, maybe it was, but not for the same reasons. But overall, I mean, it's a short life expectancy, because if you shoot the one person who can gather information, then the entire rest of the group can't get that information anymore. This brings up another story about my father that I'll tell now that relates to something that's about to happen, that we're about to talk about here. When my father was drafted, he finally decided to go into artillery. He went through basic training, and then he went to specialty school in Virginia. And he went through that training, and he got his orders to go to Vietnam. And at that point, they would give you a couple days to go home and basically say goodbye to your family. This is 66, 67. People aren't coming back at this point. People know that. So my dad gets his orders and is told he can go home for a couple of days to say goodbye to his family. It was late in the day, and so he decided that he'd stay the night. And actually, like, two of his other buddies that he'd become really good friends with that also got orders to go to Vietnam, they got the same orders and they decided to do the same thing. So this group of 3 young people who had been drafted, hadn't done this on their own, they decided to just stay around that night, go have a good meal, actually get to hang out, have some beers, and just maybe see each other and hang out for the last time. And they went to a restaurant. When they walked in the restaurant, the lady at the front of the counter looked at the 3 of them and said, the 2 of you guys can eat here, but we can't serve you here. Because one of the 2 of my dad's friends was a black guy. And this guy had been drafted. He had been told that he was going to fight overseas for the freedoms of the people of Vietnam. And this guy, he was going to risk his life and was doing it. He was just told he couldn't sit down and eat a meal in his own country. This was 1967. This is 2 years after the Voting Rights Act has been passed. 3 years after the Civil Rights Act has been passed. It's not legal to do this, but it's still happening. That tension, the idea that Americans are being told they have to go abroad to fight for the freedoms of someone else while being denied those freedoms at home, is going to help explain a lot about the anti-war movement.
This lecture is the part to buy. Daddy won't have any more Red Bull. You won't have any Red Bull. You won't have any Red Bull ever again.
LBJ comes into office, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Kennedy is assassinated, interestingly enough, the same month that Diem is assassinated. And that's why that clip I played for you is so interesting. It is John F. Kennedy reflecting on the assassination and his role in the assassination of a president of a different country when he's not going to himself live to see the end of that month. Heavy. Johnson becomes president after this. And he continues and actually intensifies Kennedy's commitment to Vietnam. And he's just as hard-nosed about it. And here's how it goes down. The problem for most Americans as of 1963, early 1964, is that they just don't... Vietnam, what is it? What's going on in this tiny country on the other side of the world? Why should we care so much about it? And that's why what happens in August of 1964 is so crucial. The U.S. has ships that are patrolling and basically gathering information. On August 2nd, 1964, there was some type of a skirmish between one of the U.S. boats and North Vietnamese. That went without a whole lot of comment. 2 days later, though, one of our ships reports that it has been attacked by the North Vietnamese. There are interviews with people that worked on that ship that said it didn't really seem like it. They reported that something was going on, but that they actually knew that the type of sonars that they used, the radars that they used, had a glitch in it that would sometimes give false reports. There's no evidence on the ship that it was attacked. But this report goes back. And even though there is no real evidence for it, Lyndon Johnson sees his chance. And the next day, he goes in front of the American people and in front of the Congress, tells the people that the U.S. has been attacked. There was no provocation. That this was a raw, out-and-out attack on the United States. And that now it was time for the United States to increase their involvement in Vietnam. 2 days later, the U.S. Congress passes what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This gives Lyndon Johnson almost unlimited power in terms of the number of soldiers and supplies and the resources that he can commit to Vietnam. This is not a declared war. Congress didn't authorize the war. What they did was they gave this authorization. It was unanimous in the House of Representatives. Passed 88-2. Only 2 people voted against it in the Senate. And it basically gave Johnson the power to use military force as he saw fit. We're now almost positive that nothing happened. And you might say, well, yeah, we're positive now, but at the time, maybe it seemed obvious that it had happened. But here's the thing. Nope. Documents have come out over the last years, and sometimes we have to wait for them. In the last couple of years, some documents came out, basically recording of the conversations that major senators had before voting for the resolution. And it's pretty clear in those conversations that everyone in the room had really big doubts about whether or not that attack actually happened. But that in the end, they decided to vote for it because they were worried that voting against the president, when people were whipped up about this attack, that voting against this could be really bad for their political careers. In the following years, people die. One of the warnings that history has for us is to be careful. The idea that we're attacked, that hits us in the gut, that makes sense. It's terrifying. Especially if you have the idea that you've done nothing. People feel scared. And in those moments, they are susceptible to unfortunate and radical solutions to problems. I remember 9/11. I was like y'all's age. I was like 22. I remember when that attack happened. People around me saying, we've got to do something. I remember people saying that even though there was no evidence linking Iraq to the attacks, I remember a family member that I love from saying to me, but are we just going to sit back and do nothing? As if the only solution might be, we've got to hit. We don't want to look weak. We got to go. And when people have those ideas laying around, you think with your gut and you don't think with your brain. Things like this happen. I'll also say another war started on a false premise. Let's go back. Mexican-American War 1848 begins in 1846. You guys remember this? Zachary Taylor moves into Texas and was there an attack? After months of waiting for it, maybe there was, but people got all whipped up. We went to war, and in the end, you get the Mexican-American War. You guys remember the Spanish-American War? You guys remember that one? Remember the Maine? Remember they sunk the Spanish treachery? They sunk our ships. You guys remember that? Oh, yeah. And people were real upset about that. Nobody really noticed the report that a similar ship had a design flaw and had exploded shortly before that. And that might be a solution. To this day, we still don't know what sunk it. But people were told it was the Spanish. And we reacted and we went to war. World War I There's the Lusitania. Well, was it carrying weapons? It's not clear. But remember the Zimmerman telegraph? Remember that one? Where the British were like, can you believe it? Can you believe that Germany said this? But you remember how the British kind of sat on that for a while? And you remember how I told you there's no way Mexico was going to actually attack us at that time? But it was sold to the Americans as a big threat. Boom, you go into war. That's a lot of coincidences in a row. And what about World War II? Remember how supposedly the Japanese attacked? Okay, that one's real. That was actually real. That happened, and definitely you can't sit back and let Nazis and Japanese nationalists take over the world. So to be fair, you got World War II. Vietnam. Questionable report. 9/11. The attacks there, which somehow spin into a war with Iraq. Just be careful, man. Because the thing you got to remember is every soldier that goes and fights abroad, they sign up to serve. They sign up for I think, admirable reasons. And this is a democracy. And whether or not they have to sacrifice is up to us. And every one of them that goes over there and fights, it's somebody's kid, somebody's father, somebody's mother, somebody's brother. So when you get mad, use your brain. Just a lesson. Now, don't worry, guys, because I know that you've heard that the Vietnam War ends really bad for the United States. Wouldn't have heard that before 1968 because Johnson just kept on telling us, dude, we are killing it over there. There's barely any communists left. Almost all the communists are scared of us because we're winning so big over there. And that's the message that Johnson is telling to the American people. It's all worth it. I know a lot of people are dying, but this is just almost over. Almost over. And then, you guys aren't going to believe this, but turns out, wasn't really going that well after all. This is something that's interesting. So, you guys remember I told you that the U.S. didn't have a standing army for most of its history, and then after World War II that happened. Here are the statistics. You can actually see this here in terms of the number of people who were called up by year. And you see that there's 1 year, 1947, where the Selective Service Act had basically expired after World War II. But then it starts to creep back up. And if you look, you go down, you go down, you go down. You can see that 1966, which was actually, I know this is the year my father was drafted because it was the largest peacetime. And that's the crazy thing. Technically a peacetime draft because this wasn't a declared war. And you can see the numbers keep going up and you see how it increases tremendously during the Vietnam War up until 1973 where the draft is over. And gradually throughout these years, Johnson begins cutting back the deferments. So by August of 1965, the marriage deferment, which would allow married people not to go, that gets cut. And you see already in 1965, even though officially we were killing it over there, 1965, you have anti-war rallies for a lot of the same reasons we talked about. And here is a picture there of them. Could you guys describe what you think of when you think of a protester during the Vietnam War? Describe the person. Who's the protester?
Hippie.
A hippie. All right. What's a hippie?
Love and drugs.
Love and drugs. And what do they look like?
Long hair, bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye, peace signs.
And here's what I love about it. How many of you guys were thinking about Forrest Gump when you said that? How many of you guys thought of hippies and you thought of the movie Forrest Gump? That movie has shaped the way that Americans think about this era in such incredible ways. It blows my mind. People often really just think, they're like, yeah, think about Jenny. And if you guys were in a classroom with me right now, I've asked like classrooms of 70 people and like 20 of them are like, yeah, absolutely. This movie did such a good job of like fixing, especially for people in my generation, because we were kids when it came out. Good history, right? You know, get your 60s and 70s history from Forrest Gump, great documentary. You also get your 1950s from Cars, get your 1860s from Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Great choice of history documentaries there. It's not exactly the way that you think. So no, Now let's go back to that other one because I want to tell you. See, the thing is not that there aren't hippies. There are hippies. Okay? But think about how you describe hippies. You didn't tell me anything about what they thought. You didn't tell me anything about like what they, cohesively did. The way you wrote them off was just like they did drugs and whatever. And yeah, you're right. I mean, if you think about what a hippie is, it's all about the clothes they wear. It's all about the things they consume. There's no like substantive thing to a hippie. The problem is that the anti-war protesters were not just hippies. This anti-war movement was actually far more dedicated. And one of the realities is it comes out of the civil rights movement. And remember I told you before that for a lot of the civil rights leaders, including especially Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the struggle they're fighting is for human rights. And that the way we've neatly categorized them historically to make them pretty conveniently comfortable and like, oh yeah, he was great, is to say, King was like, hey, we shouldn't be racist. And now we know better. So we're like, great job, Dr. King. King, a lot of his story ends in 65. And watch this the next MLK Day when they talk about him. It's basically the Voting Rights Act happens in 65. And they're like, yay, we did it. It's kind of one of our narratives about race in America. It's like, we did it in 65. So it's like, cool. So racism was done then. Why are people still complaining? And then King disappears in a lot of the narrative we have about him and only pops back up in April of 1968 when he's assassinated. Those years between 65 and 68, King becomes an ardent opponent of the Vietnam War. He, in fact, gives a speech on April 30th, 1967, why I'm opposed to the war in Vietnam. And it's this, like a lot of the same rhetoric and same reasoning for why he's against segregation.
And I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. America and most of its newspapers applauded me in Montgomery. And I stood before thousands of Negroes getting ready to riot when my home was bombed and said, we can't do it this way. They applauded us in the sit-in movement. And we nonviolently decided to sit in at lunch counters. They applauded us on the freedom rides when we accepted blows without retaliation. Oh, the press was so noble in its applause and so noble in its praise when I was saying, be nonviolent toward Bull Connor. There's something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say be nonviolent toward little brown Vietnamese children. There's something wrong with that press.
He's like, this is wrong. We're killing people we don't know. This is, we're spending money on a war overseas when we don't have, we don't have things here for our people in America. He talks a lot about justice in the same way. And a lot of these folks are smart. A lot of these folks are deeply compassionate. And yes, it does turn into a place where eventually you have a lot more hippies. And they're everywhere. And again, it's not hard to be a hippie. So you take someone with the depth of a Martin Luther King Jr., and you could follow his reasoning and his love into his opposition for the war. But you take a hippie, and you're like, hippie, 30, doing drugs, right? And yeah, that's not an unfair depiction of like that kind of movement. There were certainly people that reflected that, but it's one small moment. And what I've always thought was, it seems kind of interesting when you look at it, because in the end, it's actually a lot of the popular resistance and the protest that helps bring the war to an end. And if you look at that as actually an effective long-term movement to end something that was killing a lot of people, you might learn the lesson that action works. But if the version you told of the story was, it was just a bunch of hippies doing drugs, they didn't do anything, then the lesson you might learn is, don't even try. Just saying. That's a much more convenient narrative for people in power, but we'll move on. There's also a huge shift here in terms of the generational gap. You have this whole movement in the 1960s. Again, the women's rights movement. You have a gay rights movement. You have all types of movements. You have actually a Red Power movement of Native Americans who are fighting for their rights. But a lot of it is a new shift, whereas the World War II generation that came out of the Depression, they were concerned with economic security. The baby boom generation never knew that. Which is why in the 1950s, when I talk about like the militarization of society and people kind of like being okay with dressing certain ways and acting certain ways, that's the parents that raised a lot of these kids. But the kids have never known what it's like not to have a meal. I mean, not all of them, but by and large. The Depression generation, though, was like, dude, well, there's times when like a quarter of us were out of work. They were like, yeah, well, you know what? We'll get our hair cut a certain way and act that way if we've got a house and a place to live and, something to eat. Whereas the younger people are like, what? Those are just things we have. It's a huge generational gap that I can't, I wish I had more time to get into. So there you go. Now, these protests are going to amp up even more after, you guys aren't going to believe this. So you know how I've been telling you guys the war was going awesome and that we were like about to win it? Like, remember that? And I was like, yeah, it's totally worth it, man. Like, there's like almost no communists. There's like, we found like one in the last 3 weeks, Well, as it turns out, maybe I was lying a little bit about that to you guys. Maybe, just maybe, in fact, we've for a while now actually internally calculated that there's no way we can actually win this war, but we keep sending people over there, because it's like you don't know what to do. Surprise, surprise, you can't cover that up anymore as of January 30th, 1968. Because on that date, the 30th and the 31st, the Viet Cong, they mount a massive attack on major cities during this holiday of Tet. It's called the Tet Offensive. After this, there are 2 more phases of this offensive in 1968. Guys, during the Tet Offensive in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, the Viet Cong get all the way to the walls of the U.S. Embassy. So we're not talking they're like standing outside the city. We're talking they're in the city. They are at the walls of one of the most secure places in that entire city. So, either I've got to convince you that that one communist we couldn't find is mega strong and made it all the way there, or you're going to figure out, which is the reasonable thing, that I've been lying to you the whole time, or I'm just inept and had no clue, but more like I've been lying to you and this thing's nowhere near done, and in fact, we're on our back heel. The American public feels absolutely betrayed. Absolutely betrayed. It's only going to get worse. In fact, in June of 1971, the New York Times is going to begin publishing the Pentagon Papers. These are secret insider papers about what the government knew about Vietnam. These come out in 71 and show from the inside. I mean, these are leaked documents. Daniel Ellsberg was right on the middle of this, and he snuck these secrets out. That the government knew this was an unwinnable war. The government knew this, and they kept on sending Americans over there. They knew this, and they lied to the public about it. And this is a bombshell. Again, we now know the senators had major doubts about the Gulf of Tonkin attack. And 2005, 2006, the NSA declassified more documents. The more of these documents we get, the only thing that's happened is it's become more and more obvious how much we were lied to, how many people died for this. And I've barely been able to watch any of the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary because I've tried. It rips me up, man. That's people that I love, went through that. But it opens with there's a scene with one of the soldiers who was there talking about when he found out that he had been completely lied to. And you can imagine going because your country called you and then realizing later on it was garbage. This, again, you're starting to see the breakdown of trust between the public and the government. 68's a crazy year. April 4th, Dr. King is assassinated. Riots break out in cities across the country. On June 4th, the guy who was supposedly going to replace LBJ, by the way, Johnson, after 68, he's like, I don't think I'm going to run again. Just going to step down. He knows what's coming. But the next guy who people thought was going to be the nominee for the Democrats in 68, Robert Kennedy, he's assassinated. In August at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, tens of thousands of protesters converged. Police clash with these protesters. There is incredible footage. And across the globe, 68 is a crazy year. 1968, Prague Spring. You know, this like, you know, it looks like Czechoslovakia is going to come out of communism, and then the Soviets just send in tanks and crush it. You've got the protests in France and Paris. You've got Mexico City. 68, the world is on fire. And it looks like there's going to be big change. And in this context, you have this presidential election. And this guy shows back up. You guys remember Nixon? You guys remember him? Last time we saw him, he was like, I got beat by that cheapskate slickster over there during that TV debate. And we all believe it now. And maybe it was just an excuse. Fierce internal debate. The Democrats end up nominating Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, under Johnson. And Nixon comes back after losing in 60. He's back in 68. And he shows up. He shows up with a couple of messages. One is he's going to restore law and order. This means all these protesters out there who are making you feel uncomfortable, he's going to crack down on them. And he also promises that he has a secret strategy to end the Vietnam War. And people are like, finally, what is it? And he's like, I can't tell you. I can't tell you what it is. Like, but you have a strategy. Oh, I got a great strategy. What is it? I can't tell you, man. This is funny because, as most of you guys know, it's going to be like it's going to be well into the 70s before we begin pulling out of Vietnam. Two interesting things about this candidacy. And by the way, we're going to find out a lot about Nixon. You guys watched the Nixon by Nixon documentary yet? Did you find out a lot about Nixon? Did it improve your opinion of Nixon at all? No! Oh my goodness. I love that documentary because it is just Nixon and his advisors speaking. I mean, Nixon, it's the crazy thing about him. Nixon is paranoid as hell. He is paranoid. Top to bottom, you can see it already. And he's on the outside. And this is the thing. And this is going to sound crazy when I say it. I believe that Nixon loved America. I do believe that. I just think that he loved it in a really not okay way. It's like, and Nixon, for goodness sakes, there's so many things that happened under Nixon that like looking back were really ahead of their times. But on the inside, he was a bit of a monster. And this is part of it. You guys remember I told you about the election, right, in the South, and how the South had been solidly Democratic. And then in 1964, Goldwater comes out with this new vision of America. And I say, there's debates over how much he was trying to clue into, the civil rights struggle. You don't need to address that to understand that it worked. Because in 1964, for the first time in 100 years, the Deep South went for the Republicans. Nixon hires some pretty smart, conniving folks for his administration. And they're like, well, how do we win? Winning's what matters. And they pioneer what's called the Southern Strategy. And I just want to read this to you. This is a 1970 interview with James Boyd, who worked on the campaign, all right? These are his words for the strategy that Nixon is using to try to flip the South from Democratic to Republican, all right? All the talk about Republicans making inroads into the Negro vote is persiflage. Even Jake the Snake, Senator Jacob K. Javits, only gets 20%. From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote, and they don't need any more than that. But Republicans will be short-sighted if they weaken enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the Negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangement with the local Democrats. In other words, prod this civil rights thing, because the more it happens and the more the Democrats are associated with it, the more all the white supremacists will just jump out of the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party. This is not my words. This is literally, there's tons written on this. It's the Southern Strategy, and it's all about using racism in the South and pro-segregationism to flip the South. Let me remind you, just because you've discovered that in 1968, Richard Nixon pioneered a strategy to get Republicans to get people to join the Republican Party for racist reasons, that does not mean that every Republican today is a racist, okay? You've demonstrated something from 10 years before I was born, over half a century ago, all right? You have to accept this because it is a fact. It's not the only reason the South switched. It is not the only reason, but it is by far the most significant. And it's not so many of these things that make you feel uncomfortable. You don't like it. It happened. All right. This is, read up on it. I assure you, this Nixon, you're like, Nixon would never do something like that, would he?
I'm not a crook.
Okay, there you go. All right. So just saying. One more thing about Nixon also being pretty conniving. Check this out. So you know how Nixon had a secret plan to get the United States out of Vietnam, but he was like, shh, I don't want to tell anybody. The actual secret in 68 was that he worked behind the scenes to sabotage a potential end of the war by sending one of his representatives to Vietnam to discourage the South Vietnamese from signing a peace agreement that was during talks that were open. Nixon, so much of his hopes and his campaign promise was to end the war in Vietnam. He was worried that if the war ended before the 1968 election, he wouldn't, he'd basically lose his footing. So he sent one of his folks there. It's totally illegal. He sent folks there and, said, don't take any deal. Don't take any of these deals because these deals will they won't be worth it. I'll get you a better deal. And partially we know this because Johnson bugged Nixon. So everybody's kind of at it right at this point. That Southern strategy. You know that Southern strategy? Check this out. You think the Southern strategy worked in 68? Nope, it didn't. You want to know why? Uh-oh, look who ran in 1968 for president and won the South. Who was that? Oh, George Wallace? Yeah, remember him from the last lecture? Wallace ran in 1968 and won the Deep South. So that's the second time that a guy who's like
Segregation forever
sweeps the South. It's astonishing. But Nixon makes inroads. South Carolina, Florida, most of North Carolina, Tennessee. You can see it working. And then you're like, but what about 72? Did that reveal whether or not that worked? Here's the thing. It's kind of hard to tell because this is the electoral map from 1972 when Nixon ran for re-election. Dude, you'd think that someone with this type of numbers would have not been worried in the slightest about the 1972 election. Paranoia is a hell of a drug. We'll find out in the next lecture whether or not Nixon secretly was trying to bug the Democrats' headquarters in spite of this type of a victory coming. And we'll learn whether or not that today continues to shape our sentiments about the U.S. government. Actually, I'm going to tell you now. It does. I'll tell you more next time. Thanks for being here. Take care.